Um, Imagine looking at a continent's bank account,
Right.
and you just see it growing, like leaps and bounds, passing $4,442 per person.
Right, which sounds amazing.
Exactly. I mean, you probably pop the champagne. If you're listening to this, you'd look at that and assume the policies are working, the standard of living is just skyrocketing, and, entire region is finally catching up to the rest of the world.
Yeah, you would think that.
But, and this is the hook for today,
Yeah.
what if I told you that exact same growth is actually the sound of an economy, like eating itself alive?
It's honestly the ultimate macroeconomic paradox. You see a line on a chart pointing up, and you just assume it represents progress.
Right.
But if you look closer, that upward trajectory isn't being fueled by innovation or, sustainable development. It's being fueled by liquidation.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're joining us today, you're here because you don't just want the top-level headline, all right? You want to know how the machine actually works.
Exactly. The reality beneath the surface.
Yeah. So today, we are looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're going to use an incredibly revealing economic lens based on a very specific, curated, 15-part logic model drawn directly from World Bank datasets to completely deconstruct that $4,000 GDP success story.
Because we really need to figure out why a region can look like it's getting richer on paper while its actual physical wealth is just quietly plummeting.
Right. And to do that, we kind of have to rethink how we measure wealth entirely, don't we?
We do. I mean, we are so conditioned just as a society to look at gross domestic product, GDP.
The holy grail of numbers.
Exactly. But GDP is really just a measure of transaction volume. It measures how much money changed hands. It absolutely does not tell you if you actually built anything of lasting value. So for that, economists use a much more rigorous metric. It's called adjusted net savings.
Adjusted net savings. Okay, and this is really the core mission of our deep dive today, because when you apply that specific metric to the economies of Sub-Saharan Africa, the whole success story completely fractures.
It really does. It falls apart.
So we are going to trace exactly how this happens for you guys today. We're going to look at the illusion of macroeconomic growth. We'll explore this really intense demographic and agricultural trap, uncover a massive deficit in human capital, and then finally, look at the actionable path forward.
Right, because we aren't just going to diagnose the illness here.
No, definitely not.
We're going to identify the specific structural bottlenecks that have to be broken to, actually reverse this trend.
Okay, so let's jump right into this macro illusion. If you walk into a central bank or look at a standard national accounts ledger for some of these countries, the gross savings rate actually looks incredibly healthy.
Very healthy.
Like, there are periods in the data where the gross savings in Sub-Saharan Africa reach over 24% of gross national income.
Which is huge.
Right. Mathematically, if a society is saving a quarter of everything it earns, that should be an economic juggernaut in the making.
Yeah, that's money that should be building bridges, funding research, capitalizing new businesses. And it absolutely should be. I mean, a 24% gross savings rate implies a society that is highly disciplined, right? Deferring immediate consumption to build a foundation for tomorrow.
But there's a catch.
A massive catch. Gross savings has a fatal flaw as an economic indicator. It is entirely blind to the origin of the money. It doesn't care if you earn that money by, say, inventing a revolutionary new software platform, or if you earned it by chopping down every single tree in your country and selling the timber.
Which is where this adjusted net savings thing comes in as the ultimate reality check.
Exactly. Think of adjusted net savings, or ANS, as the honest accountant.
Okay, I like that. The honest accountant.
Right. So the honest accountant walks into the room, looks at that 24% savings rate, and says, hold on, we have to make some deductions.
Deductions for what?
First, they subtract the depletion of natural capital. So how much of the forest did you permanently clear cut this year? Subtract that value. Yeah. How much oil, gas, and coal did you pump out of the ground and burn? Subtract that. How many thousands of tons of copper and cobalt did you dig up and export? Subtract that too.
Because those aren't renewable. I mean, once you dig up a ton of copper and put it on a ship, it's gone forever. You can't sell that exact same ton of copper next year.
Precisely. You have converted a physical asset into cash, but the honest accountant doesn't stop there.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. ANS also subtracts the economic damage caused by pollution. Specifically, it calculates the long-term health and productivity costs of particulate emissions in the air.
Wow.
Because if your economic activity is causing massive respiratory illness in your workforce, that is a direct drain on your future wealth. So you subtract that damage from your savings.
Okay, so when this honest accountant finishes making all these subtractions, the forests, the energy, the minerals, the particulate pollution, what actually happens to that beautiful 24% savings rate?
It completely implodes. Yeah. The national savings rate routinely drops straight through the floor and into negative territory. Historically, the data shows it oscillating between negative 4.0% and negative 0.24% for extended periods.
Wait, negative 4%. So they aren't saving a quarter of their income at all.
You know.
They are literally becoming poorer year over year.
Yes. Because the liquidation of their natural assets is totally outpacing their actual wealth creation. I mean, the net forest depletion alone has hovered near 4% of gross national income.
4% just in forests.
Yeah, sometimes peaking around 3.93%. And then energy depletion easily exceeds 3%, like 3.13% in some peaks.
Yeah.
When you combine those, the math is just brutal.
I want to make sure we're really crystallizing this for the listener because it's
Yeah.
such a wild concept. If I decide to, like, sell off the roof of my house to buy groceries, my income for that specific month looks fantastic.
Right, your bank account is flush with cash, GDP goes up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But my actual net wealth is plummeting because
Okay.
my house is now missing a roof. It's losing its structural integrity, and the moment it rains, the inside gets ruined.
That's a great way to look at it.
Are you saying these economies are basically selling their roofs, their forest, and their energy and disguising it as economic growth?
The roof metaphor is spot on, yeah, because it really highlights the vulnerability. Economists call this dynamic the resource curse.
The resource curse.
Right. And the mechanism behind it is fascinating, but also super destructive. When a country relies almost exclusively on extracting and exporting natural resources, it artificially inflates the value of its currency,
Okay.
which makes any other potential exports like manufactured goods or agriculture too expensive for the global market.
So they can't compete.
Exactly. This is often called Dutch disease, so the entire economy warps around the single task of digging holes and cutting trees.
And there's no real value being added. You aren't taking the copper, turning it into wire, using the wire to build a motor, and selling the motor. You're just selling the raw dirt.
Exactly. There's virtually no technological innovation required to just dig up dirt and put it on a truck. You aren't building a complex, globally competitive service sector. You're just running a liquidation sale on your geography.
That is so bleak.
And if you don't take the cash from that liquidation and immediately reinvest it into something that generates future sustainable returns, like, say, a world-class education system or permanent infrastructure, your net wealth permanently decreases. You are objectively poorer than you were before you dug the hole.
So if a country is rapidly selling off its physical roof, it has to rely on its people to build a new one.
Yeah.
The human element has to step up.
Right, human capital.
And you hear this narrative constantly in geopolitical discussions, right? Everyone points to Africa's massive population boom as this incredible demographic dividend.
You hear that phrase all the time.
Yeah. The idea is that an explosion of young, energetic workers is going to drive the next century of global economic growth. But if that's true, why isn't that demographic dividend translating into positive adjusted net savings?
Because a population boom is not automatically a dividend. That is a massive misconception.
Oh, really?
Yeah. A booming population is only an economic dividend if those young people have productive, value-generating jobs to step into. If those jobs don't exist, and if the infrastructure to support those people doesn't exist, a population boom is actually a profound economic anchor.
Which brings us right into the demographic and agricultural trap from the source data. The age dependency ratio in this region is just staggering.
It really is. So just to define it, the age dependency ratio is the mathematical relationship between the working age adults and the dependents, meaning the children and the elderly.
Okay.
It basically measures the societal weight that the workforce has to carry on its shoulders.
And the reality on the ground is that while this ratio has slowly ticked down from a massive peak of nearly 95% down to around 79%,
Yeah.
the sheer absolute numbers are just overwhelming. I mean, a 79% dependency ratio means that for every 100 working age adults, there are 79 dependents who need to be fed, clothed, housed, and educated.
Think about the economic friction that creates at the household level. If an adult is spending 90% of their income and energy just keeping their dependents alive, There is zero surplus capital left over.
You can't start a business.
Exactly. You can't save for a tractor or invest in a new skill. Now, it's true that the adolescent fertility rate has dropped from a historical high of 161 births per 1,000 women down to around 93.
Which is progress.
It is progress. But the base of the population is so incredibly wide that the absolute total number of new mouths to feed continues to surge exponentially.
And the surging population crashes headfirst into a hard physical constraint, right?
The land.
The land. This is the part of the agricultural data that completely reframes the narrative for me. While the population is exploding, the arable land per capita is just falling off a cliff. We're looking at a drop from 0.54 hectares per person down to a mere 0.20 hectares.
That shrinking number, 0.20 hectares, is really the defining physical bottleneck of the entire region. It's basically the cage around the economy.
I keep picturing a factory. Imagine a company that hires thousands of new workers every single day. The workforce is booming. But at the exact same time, management is actively shrinking the square footage of the factory floor.
Right.
You keep packing people in, but there are no new assembly lines, no new machines. Eventually, the workers are just standing shoulder to shoulder, bumping elbows, fighting over the same basic tools, and absolutely nothing extra gets produced.
The shrinking factory is a brilliant way to visualize subsistence agriculture. You have millions of people locked into a farming sector where their individual plot of land is constantly getting smaller as it gets subdivided among children.
Because there's just less to go around.
Exactly. I mean, 2/10 of a hectare is roughly half an acre. You cannot run a highly efficient, mechanized commercial farm on half an acre.
No.
You can't justify buying a combine harvester for a plot of land that small. You are reduced to the absolute most basic manual subsistence farming.
You're just using a hoe to grow enough cassava or maize to keep your immediate family from starving that month. There's no cash crop.
None. And the demographic reality within this trap is heavily, heavily gendered. Women still make up around 60% of the agricultural workforce in this region.
Wow. So the reality on the ground is a majority female workforce trapped on shrinking half-acre plots of land, performing grueling manual labor just for basic caloric survival.
Yes. And historically, if you look at how nations industrialized, whether it was Britain in the 18th century or East Asia in the 20th century, agriculture has to become hyper-efficient first.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Because you need a system where a handful of farmers with advanced machinery can produce enough surplus food to feed massive cities. That food surplus is what frees up the rest of the rural labor force to migrate to urban centers and work in factories, tech hubs, and service industries.
Okay, that makes total sense. You can't have an industrial revolution if 60% of your population is required to be in the dirt just to prevent famine.
Exactly. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, that shrinking land-to-worker ratio completely stalls that natural economic progression. The labor force is basically trapped. There is no massive agricultural surplus, and therefore there is no surplus labor being freed up to build higher-value industries. The demographic dividend isn't paying out because, like you said, the workforce is just bumping elbows in a shrinking factory.
Okay, so if the physical land cannot support the population boom, the only escape hatch is the knowledge economy.
Right.
If you don't have enough land to farm, your brain has to become the asset. You need to code, engineer, manage logistics, or design systems. But to do that, you need an ironclad foundation of human capital.
That is the only viable escape route. Human capital absolutely has to replace natural capital.
But when we look at the reality of human development in this region, and this is from slide 7 of the source material, it isn't an escape hatch at all. It's an invisible crisis.
Invisible is the perfect word for it, because if you only listen to top-level political talking points, you miss it entirely. Politicians love to quote primary school completion rates.
Sure.
To be fair, those have climbed to about 69%. That sounds like a massive victory. More kids sitting at desks than ever before.
Right. But sitting at a desk is not the same thing as acquiring human capital. And this brings up a concept that is, frankly, terrifying from an economic standpoint. It's called learning poverty.
Yes, learning poverty.
We aren't just talking about a lack of textbooks here. We are talking about a systemic, institutional failure to transfer actual knowledge to a human brain.
Learning poverty actually measures the inability of a child to read and understand a simple text by the age of 10. It is the literal difference between being physically present in a room and actually getting an education.
And the disparities inside this learning poverty are just jaw-dropping. We see specific regional cohorts in the analysis where there is an overall reading failure rate of around 3.3% at the end of primary school. But when you look under the hood of that 3.3%, the gender divide is a chasm.
It's massive.
You have a 2.2% failure rate for boys compared to a staggering 79.6% failure rate for girls in these localized data sets.
Let's just pause and really consider the macroeconomic weight of that number. Why is that gap so massive?
Yeah, why?
Well, it's not biological, it's entirely structural. It's a combination of cultural expectations that prioritize boys' education when household funds are tight, the demand for young girls to perform unpaid domestic labor.
Like gathering water and firewood.
Exactly. Plus early marriage customs, and honestly, a severe lack of sanitary facilities in rural schools, which just physically forces pubescent girls to stay home.
So the system is actively filtering them out.
Actively filtering them out. When nearly 80% of young girls in these specific cohorts fail to achieve bare minimum reading proficiency by the time they leave primary school, you are systematically amputating half of your future knowledge economy.
That's just devastating.
It is. You are guaranteeing that these girls will be funneled directly back into that shrinking half-acre agricultural trap we just talked about.
And even for the kids who do stay in school, the physical environment is impossible. The average pupil-to-teacher ratio is stuck in this dire range of 37 to 44 students per teacher.
Oh, it's unmanageable.
I mean, have you ever tried to teach 44 10-year-olds how to read a new language in a single under-ventilated room? That isn't pedagogy, that's crowd control.
Yeah, you're just trying to keep them in their seats.
You cannot build a generation of software engineers and biomedical researchers in a room with 44 kids and one exhausted teacher.
You absolutely cannot. But the crisis of human capital actually starts long before that child ever walks into a classroom.
Really?
Yeah, it starts in the first 1,000 days of life. And this brings us to a really fascinating and frankly heartbreaking paradox in the public health data.
The life expectancy paradox.
Yes. Over the last few decades, life expectancy at birth in Sub-Saharan Africa has jumped massively from 41.4 years to 62.6 years.
That is a 20-year leap. That's an incredible triumph for global health initiatives, malaria nets, vaccination campaigns, clean water. People are surviving.
They are surviving, but surviving is not the same as thriving. While the mortality rates have dropped, the rates of early childhood stunting, severe wasting, and general undernourishment remain incredibly stubbornly high among kids under 5.
Okay, can you explain stunting? Because I think when people hear stunting, they just think, oh, the child is a little shorter than average.
Right, and it is so much more devastating than just height. Stunting is the physical manifestation of chronic malnutrition during the absolute most critical window of brain development, from conception to age 2.
Okay.
If a toddler does not get adequate protein, fats, and micronutrients, their body makes a biological triage decision. It basically shuts down complex neural development to keep the vital organs running.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the brain simply does not get the raw materials it needs to build complex neural pathways.
So it creates a permanent biological ceiling on their cognitive ability.
It's irreversible. You cannot fix it with a better diet when they are 12 years old. The window is closed, so a child survives infancy, which boosts the life expectancy statistics, but they are stunted.
Right.
They then walk into a classroom with 43 other kids. They physically lack the neurological foundation to master complex problem solving, and the teacher, obviously, doesn't have the time to give them individualized attention.
Because there's 43 other kids.
Exactly. That child is not accumulating human capital. They are effectively locked out of the modern economy before they even learn to hold a pencil.
And if we look at this through the cold, unforgiving lens of macroeconomics, this is the ultimate tragedy of that adjusted net savings calculation we talked about at the start. If your national strategy is to drain the oil well and chop down the forest to generate cash, you absolutely must use that cash to build a high-tech, high-skill workforce to replace the lost resources.
Exactly. You are swapping natural capital for human capital.
But if the kids who are supposed to invent the solar panels to replace the oil or design the high-yield, drought-resistant crops to replace the forests are sitting in a classroom of 44, stunted from early childhood malnutrition, and unable to read a basic text, you are trapped.
You have a double deficit.
The natural wealth is gone, and the human wealth was never built.
That is the exact mechanism that drives the true savings rate into the negative. You are burning the furniture to heat the house, and no one knows how to build new furniture.
Okay, so let's even imagine a scenario where we wave a magic wand. Let's say we fix the schools, we eradicate childhood malnutrition entirely, and suddenly you have a generation of brilliant, literate, ambitious young adults ready to build a modern economy.
Okay, best case scenario.
Right. What happens when they walk out of the schoolhouse doors? Are they stepping into a physical environment that can even support their ambitions?
And that takes us from the human capital crisis directly into the physical infrastructure disconnect, because the answer, currently, is no.
Yeah.
A highly educated workforce still needs electricity, logistics, and digital connectivity to generate wealth. And the physical foundations in this region are shockingly fragile.
Let's talk about energy first, because the reality of how people power their lives is a massive bottleneck.
Yeah.
If you look at rural areas, the access to clean fuels and cooking technologies is abysmal.
It really is.
It started near 2.5% and has struggled to even climb past 8.8%. And just to be clear for you listening, when we say clean fuels, we aren't talking about fancy induction stovetops or smart grids.
No, not at all.
We are talking about the bare minimum of not having to burn raw wood, charcoal, or animal dung inside your home just to boil water.
Right, and the economic ripple effects of that single statistic are massive. First, gathering that wood is incredibly labor-intensive, and that labor falls almost entirely on women and young girls.
Which pulls them right out of education or productive work.
Exactly. Second, burning biomass indoors creates severe indoor air pollution. It causes chronic respiratory diseases, which loops right back into the health damage we subtract in the adjusted net savings calculation.
It's degrading the very human capital we just talked about trying to build.
It's a vicious cycle. And then you try to look at the modern digital economy. The world currently runs on data, cloud computing, digital logistics, secure online banking. But the reality on the ground shows a catastrophic deficit in secure internet servers per million people.
I mean, without secure servers, you just don't have a digital economy.
No. Lacking server infrastructure in the 21st century is the exact equivalent of lacking paved roads or deep water ports in the 19th century. You simply cannot participate in global trade. You are totally locked out.
And speaking of trade, the actual physical logistics are just as punishing. When you look at the international trade balance, high-tech manufactured exports make up a microscopic sliver of total exports.
Because, again, they're exporting the raw copper dirt, not the microchips. They're exporting the raw cocoa beans, not the packaged chocolate.
But the kicker here is the cost of moving those raw materials. Transport services represent a massive bloated cost in the international balance of payments. Why does it cost so much to ship things out of Sub-Saharan Africa?
Because the physical infrastructure connecting the interior to the coast is just incredibly inefficient. If you don't have reliable electrified freight rail or multi-lane paved highways or automated ports, moving a ton of raw copper from a mine in the interior to a ship on the coast requires a fleet of diesel trucks driving on degrading roads.
And facing delays, bribes, mechanical breakdown.
Exactly. It artificially inflates the cost of doing business across the entire continent. You are selling low-value dirt, and you are paying high-value transport premiums just to move it. The profit margins are practically non-existent.
So you have a fragile physical infrastructure, a disconnected digital infrastructure, and extremely thin economic margins. And just when you think the system can't handle any more stress, we have to talk about the great threat multiplier.
The black swan.
Yes, the black swan that hovers over this entire economic model, climate change.
Yeah.
There is a brutal, almost cruel irony in how climate change impacts Sub-Saharan Africa. From a global perspective, the region's carbon footprint is basically a rounding error. They barely contribute to global CO2 emissions.
Right.
The emissions they do have come mostly from basic agriculture and older transport vehicles. They do not have grids powered by massive fleets of coal-fired power plants. They didn't cause the climate crisis.
They carry the lowest carbon footprint on Earth, but they bear the absolute highest vulnerability risk.
Exactly. The exposure to droughts, catastrophic floods, and extreme temperature anomalies is higher here than almost anywhere else. And I want to tie this back to the shrinking factory metaphor we used earlier. Why is climate change so uniquely devastating to this specific economic setup?
Think about the 60% of women locked into half-acre plots of rain-fed subsistence agriculture. Rain-fed is the key term there.
Right.
They do not have deep well irrigation systems powered by solar pumps. They completely rely on the seasonal rains. If a country's economy is diversified, like if you have a massive software sector, manufacturing, and financial services, a severe drought is a problem, sure, but it's just a drag on a few percentage points of GDP. the country survives.
But if half your entire population is standing on a half-acre plot waiting for the rain?
If the rain doesn't fall, the economy doesn't just slow down, it stops. A single severe drought or an unseasonal flood wipes out the entire foundation of employment, wipes out the food security, and forces millions of people into immediate crisis.
And all the marginal gains in health and education are wiped out overnight.
Overnight, because families have to pull kids out of school to search for water or work for food.
It's an economy with absolutely no shock absorbers.
None. The vulnerability is entirely structural.
Okay, this has been an incredibly heavy diagnosis. We've laid out the pieces of the puzzle. We have the resource drain, where the natural wealth is dug up and exported. We have the demographic trap, where population growth outpaces the physical land.
Right.
We have the failing education and health systems, creating a biological and cognitive ceiling on human capital. And we have the weak physical infrastructure that disconnects them from global trade and leaves them completely exposed to climate shocks.
It's a lot.
If we leave it there, it's just a tragedy. But the purpose of exploring this logic model today isn't just to admire the problem. It is to find the fulcrum. How do we fix this? Let's move into the final phase of our deep dive, mapping the systemic bottlenecks and the path forward.
So, to fix a broken factory line, you have to map the flow. Economists look at this crisis in three distinct stages: inputs, process, and outputs.
Let's trace the line. What are the inputs?
Stage one, the inputs. You have a massive population boom combined with rapidly shrinking arable land per capita. That forces an agricultural lockdown. Too many people trying to survive on too little land, producing absolutely no surplus capital.
Which flows straight into stage two.
Stage two is the process. Because there is no surplus capital, the social systems collapse. You have a massive human capital gap characterized by extreme learning poverty, a lack of teachers, and irreversible early childhood stunting. The people are physically and cognitively trapped. They literally cannot transition out of the agricultural lockdown into higher order economic roles.
And that inevitably leads to the outputs.
Stage three, the outputs. Because the country cannot generate wealth through high-tech industry, services, or efficient manufacturing, the government resorts to the only option left: resource over extraction.
They sell the roof.
They sell the roof. You combine that liquidation with a complete disconnect from digital infrastructure, and the final output is exactly what we started the show with: a negative adjusted net savings.
The conclusion is so stark, but so logical when you lay it out like that. Any GDP growth that is maintained purely by burning natural capital without building the human capital to replace it is false prosperity. It's an illusion.
Yeah.
It is a car driving 80 miles an hour by cannibalizing its own engine parts.
It is entirely unsustainable. But by mapping the factory line, we can also see exactly where we need to intervene. The structural models suggest three strategic, mandatory recommendations for a systemic rebuild, a way to actually reverse the equation and generate real wealth.
Let's hear the actionable path forward.
Recommendation 1. Stop the bleeding of natural capital. Governments must systematically and aggressively transition away from a pure reliance on exporting raw minerals and timber. They need to implement high tax capture on resource extraction. But more importantly, there must be legally mandated, transparent reinvestment of those taxes into sustainable assets. If you are going to sell the roof, the money cannot go into the general fund to pay for immediate consumption or bloated public payrolls. It must go into building a new foundation.
Okay, I have to push back here. Implementing a tax capture in regions that historically struggle with weak institutions, bureaucratic inefficiency, or, outright corruption. It isn't just flipping a switch. You could write a law that says tax the copper mine. But how does a government actually enforce that reinvestment?
That is absolutely the hardest political hurdle. It requires tying resource extraction contracts to sovereign wealth funds with independent oversight, often requiring international auditing. The political will required is immense because politicians love to use resource cash for short-term political handouts. But macroeconomic reality doesn't care about politics. If they don't capture and reinvest that wealth, they will simply go bankrupt when the mines run dry.
Fair enough. Stop treating natural resources as an ATM. What's the second intervention?
Recommendation 2. Rebuild basic education from the ground up. The entire regional mindset must shift away from simply scaling enrollment. Stop bragging about how many kids are in the building and focus entirely on eliminating learning poverty.
Quality over quantity.
Exactly. Putting 44 kids in a room with one teacher is a failure, not a success. Funding must brutally target teacher-to-student ratios and guarantee absolute mastery of basic literacy and numeracy before anything else. Quality must ruthlessly supersede quantity.
It's the difference between building 100 leaky boats versus building 10 boats that actually float.
Great analogy.
And the third.
Recommendation 3. Empower women and tech. The demographic dividend will only ever be unlocked when women have absolute equal educational and economic footing, coupled with widespread digital infrastructure to connect them to the global economy.
All three of those sound great in a white paper. But let's be real. Governments have limited budgets, limited time, and limited political capital. You can't do everything at once. If you had to point to the single most critical domino in this entire chain, the one thing that needs to fall first to trigger a reversal of this negative wealth trend, what is it?
If you look at the deep interconnectedness of the data, the choice is clear. Empowering women, specifically through a relentless focus on female education, is the ultimate catalyst. It is the single domino that knocks down the most bottlenecks simultaneously.
Walk me through the cascade. Why is keeping a 12-year-old girl in school the ultimate macroeconomic lever?
Think about what happens when you keep that girl in a high-quality educational environment and ensure she achieves true literacy rather than having her fail basic reading and get funneled into unpaid domestic labor or half-acre farming.
Right.
First, female education naturally and dramatically lowers the adolescent fertility rate. Women who spend more years in school choose to marry later and have fewer, healthier children.
Which immediately begins to ease the severe pressure on the arable land.
Yeah.
You start solving the shrinking factory problem, and you lower that crushing age dependency ratio.
Exactly. You reduce the inputs into the agricultural trap. Second, educated mothers are vastly more likely to understand and secure better prenatal care, proper nutrition for their infants, and clean water. They have the agency to advocate for their children's health.
Wow.
That direct action combats the early childhood stunting crisis, ensuring the next generation actually reaches their full cognitive potential.
So you completely shatter the biological ceiling on human capital.
Yes. And third, by bringing that 80% of girls who were previously failing out of the system back into the skilled economy, you literally double your available brain power.
You double it.
You create the massive literate workforce necessary to build the digital infrastructure, manage the secure servers, engineer the supply chains, and finally transition the economy away from raw resource extraction. Empowering women isn't just a moral imperative or a social goal. From a purely mathematical standpoint, it is the most efficient economic lever available to reverse negative adjusted net savings.
Wow. When you lay it out like that, it all connects. It's not just about tweaking one isolated metric. It's about understanding how the entire system breathes together. The land, the school, the health, the gender dynamics, the resources, they're all the same machine.
It's all connected.
So to summarize this incredibly complex reality for you, the listener, gross domestic product is just a speedometer. It tells you how fast your economy is moving right now. But adjusted net savings is the fuel gauge. It tells you if you actually have any fuel left in the tank to keep going tomorrow.
That's perfect.
Sub-Saharan Africa is moving incredibly fast on the speedometer, but according to the brutal reality of the data, it is burning its own engine parts to maintain that speed.
It is a sobering reality, but as we discussed, it also provides a precise map for how to fix it. If you know exactly where the leaks are, you know exactly what to patch.
Definitely.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, a provocation to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
Lean on us.
We have spent this entire time applying this rigorous, unforgiving, adjusted net savings lens to Sub-Saharan Africa. We ruthlessly subtracted their environmental damage, their carbon emissions, and the depletion of their natural resources to expose their true wealth.
Yeah.
But think about the rest of the world. Think about the highly industrialized West. If we aggressively applied that exact same honest accounting, if we subtracted decades of catastrophic environmental damage, massive historic carbon emissions that have altered the global climate, and the relentless ongoing depletion of global resources from the GDPs of the wealthiest nations on Earth,
Oh, wow.
how many of the world's so-called richest countries are actually running a massive hidden wealth deficit of their own?
That is a phenomenal question. Are we all just driving blindly with broken fuel gauges, celebrating our speed while the tank runs dry? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to take this adjusted net savings framework, apply it to the daily economic news, and view every headline through this entirely new lens. Stop asking just how fast we are growing and start demanding to know whether we are actually generating real, sustainable wealth. We will see you next time.